naked, right? He knew now. The innocence was stolen that was there at one time. But the point of this story is not just to look back. The story helps us to look forward, right? It's hard to understand why, when Ham is the one that sins, Noah curses his son Canaan, right? That would be like, if my son Finn were to sin against me, I would curse his future son that probably wasn't even born yet. That'd be strange, right? And strangely, Canaan was not even Ham's firstborn son. In chapter 10, we hear whose Ham's sons were. They were Cush, Egypt, Put, and then the fourth one was Canaan. Why does he curse Canaan? Can you think of what the significance of Canaan is in the Old Testament later? Yes, the Canaanites, they were the people who lived in the promised land that Israel had to push out, drive out, in order to take back the promised land, right? These were the people, the Canaanites, that God told Joshua and the army to completely destroy, which is really hard for people to, you're not even just killing their army, you're killing their women and their children and all their livestock. You're putting them to death. They're completely done. And God didn't tell Joshua and the Israelites to do that to everyone. It's just the Canaanites, right? The Amorites and the people that came from them, that group of people, to totally destroy them. Maybe it has something to do with this curse. Maybe we're supposed to see from this curse, looking forward, what God's plans were. But of course, in this curse, Canaan, look at verse 25 and 26. Canaan is not, it doesn't say that he's going to be put to death, but that he'll be the lowest of slaves. We actually, in early American history, there was an unfortunate misinterpretation of this verse. Do you know what people did with this verse? They used the cursing of Canaan as reason to enslave black people. And that's because from Ham's descendants came Africans. But Canaan was not an African. He wasn't black, right? Actually, the Canaanites were a type of Caucasian. And so it's unfortunate for that people did what they wanted to with the scripture. But we need to keep the big picture in mind. I think the cursing of Canaan has more to do with the future than what happens here in Genesis 9. Yeah, you saw your father naked, but look at the big picture of what's happening, right? Canaan's descendants are the ones who are going to be living in the promised land, which I think was the Garden of Eden. These people are sinning in the Garden of Eden, just like Adam and Eve did. They are worshiping idols. They are committing sexual immorality. They're violent, the Canaanite people. They are putting their children to death through child sacrifice. And we're looking forward to a time where God's going to say enough, and he's going to put them to death, just like Adam and Eve. Death was pronounced on them when they sinned in the sacred space. Yes?
I think it is significant that the response to sin, to wickedness, was not godly. The response that we have when there is lust and when there is a joke out of something like that, that's not godly. So we can apply that to our response to bodies. There's nothing sinful about the body as a body, but the way we respond to it, if it is not a godly response, then the curse is on us.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on. I know I went over that quickly, but we're going to move on to what's called the Table of Nations. So in Genesis 9:19, we're told that from Noah's 3 sons came all the people who exist or scattered throughout the earth. And so we all are descended from Noah, is the idea. Many of the names in Noah's descendants, if you read in chapter 10, and we're not going to read it out loud, but if you look through it, a lot of those names of the descendants are actually country names. From these people became countries, like Ham's son Egypt. From Ham's son Egypt came the Egyptians, right? Or the Cushites. The Cushites were people who lived in Ethiopia, right? So all these people groups spread out throughout the earth. And one thing that's interesting and important, I think, is that there are a total of 70 names listed in the Table of Nations in chapter 10. Now, can you think why the number 70? Can anybody get this? Why is the number 70 important? Where else do you see that in Scripture? Well, that would be 7. I guess 70 is, yeah.
Jacob and his family going to Egypt.
Good. Yes. At the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob and his family members, which totaled 70, they wanted us to know that for sure, went down to Egypt. And the connection is intentional, I think. At the end of the book, the new family, the nation of Israel, replaces Noah's family as God's covenant people who are going to be fruitful and multiply and be God's representatives. That's the idea. So Noah's family spreads out throughout the whole earth, but God picks a family in the person of Abraham to spread out and become his people. There's another time in the Gospels where the number 70 is important. Does anybody remember?
Sent out by Jesus.
Yes, Jesus sent out 70 disciples, though some translations, actually some manuscripts, say 72, and some say 70. But I think the idea is similar. These people, the disciples of Jesus, are the true people of God who are going to spread out throughout the earth, be fruitful and multiply, and do what God has commanded. I have a PowerPoint screen here I would like to show you. Okay, I can barely see that, so that probably means you can barely see that too. Sorry about that. But this is just a map. Thank you, Michael, of how they spread out. So the sons of Shem, from which came the Israelites, right? Abraham is a descendant of Shem. That was the area there where they spread out to. Japheth spread out north and then to the west as well. I believe most of us come from the people of Japheth, if I understand it correctly. And then the people of Ham spread down into Africa and a little bit in other places as well. And so this is called the Table of Nations, how they all spread out. The point of the Table of Nations is to show us that the original blessings, God said, be fruitful and multiply, that's still in effect. Even though there was a flood, even though the whole human race was destroyed besides Noah and his sons and their wives, God is still fulfilling his purpose in the sons of Noah. He also wants to show us that even though the blessing is still going on, so is the spreading of sin. Even as early as Ham, right? We have sin back in the picture, and it's going to start to spread, and we're going to see that all throughout the rest of the Bible. Sin, even though they're spreading out all across the world, so is sin. And this also, the reason why we have the Table of Nations, all the names, and you can see where they go, the point is to move the story onward. We are moving on toward God's elect people, the Hebrews. And they are the descendants of Shem. So yeah, here's the big picture. Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and all where they go, and all the people that came from them. And then we narrow in. This is what became of. This is the account of. This is the Toledot of Shem. And we have the story of Abraham, right? So we're narrowing in. If you remember, that's how the author of Genesis moves things along. He starts out big, the whole of creation. Then he narrows to mankind. And then he narrows to Seth. And then he narrows to Noah. And now he's going to narrow to Shem's descendants, Abraham, right? I want you to look in verse 10 at one verse, verse 25. I think there's a significant little statement in here. 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. What do you think that means? The earth was divided. What time is this referring to? I don't think it's Pangea, if anybody comes to that mind. I don't think it's talking about the land being divided. I think it's talking about the people. I think this is getting us ready for the Tower of Babel, when all the people will be scattered all over. I think there's a division and things like that that's going to happen. Okay? It's getting us ready for that. And so, let's move on. We're going to spend the majority of our time today in the Tower of Babel passage. Look at chapter 11, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 9. And as I read this, look for questions that just pop into your mind. Like, this is a good way to read Scripture, actually. Why does this happen? Why does it say this? Like, what is the point of that? Instead of, assuming we understand everything, it's good to question things. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found in the plain of Shinar and settled there. They found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that they may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. And the Lord said, "If as one people, speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because the Lord had confused the language of the whole world. And from there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Okay, so let's start out, instead of trying to interpret it right away, let's start out asking some questions. So if you have some questions about the passage, ask it. Sloan will bring you the mic. But here are some of my questions. Was there a problem with people settling in a certain place? They go to Shinar, and that seems like, to me, there's some sort of problem with that. What was the offense that these people made that God caused their language to be? What did they do wrong, right? Is it wrong to build a city or build a tower? What's the point of making a name for themselves? Is this like a prideful act? What's the point about that? Why are they afraid to be scattered over the earth? Why is that just such a terrible thing that they're building a city and a tower to be congregated together? Is confusing languages a punishment? What did God use to scatter the people? Like, it just says that they were scattered. It doesn't say how they were scattered, right? So, do you have questions? Not answers, but do you have questions about this passage? Karen.
I just have the question that if building a tower and making a name for themselves was a problem, we've built what I assume to be way bigger towers and bigger cities. Why has that been and we've learned other languages. So
Yes.
why does he not act now?
Good question. Jim over here. Back there. The big orange guy.
To answer your question, he possibly is dividing us. We read these things in verses, but they probably happened over decades, or maybe even centuries. So God's always working, and he could be actually it's interesting because even the Canaanite issue is an issue in America right now, as we look at Hamas and Israel being a dividing thing. So God's still working.
Good question, Jim. Just kidding. Yeah.
It's kind of strange to me that God came down. He had come down to see what was going on.
Yeah, why does he need to come down?
Yeah.
Can't he see everything from heaven?
Yeah.
Know everything?
Although he does make these appearances, what's the word I want? Epiphany? What is the word I want? Anyway,
yes.
he appears as man.
He reveals himself.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. I mean, there's a lot of questions in this text. I'm sure we could go on and on. Yes, Maureen, right here.
Were they trying to reach God? They went to the heavens.
Good
They
question.
were trying to go to the heavens. I'm just wondering about that.
Good. Okay. All right. Let's go through the text and see if we can answer some of these questions. I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them, but maybe. So they have verse 1. The whole world has common speech, one language. Languages are formed, right, because people are at a distance from each other. They see things, they give name. If they were all together, if they were all sharing, they would be using the same words. But their distance, their scattering, causes the languages to be different. And then in verse 2, they journey eastward to a plain in Shinar and settle there. Shinar was also called Sumer, which later became the area where Babylon was. Okay, Sumer was the site of the earliest known civilization in history, from what I understand. And both Babylon and Assyria were located there a couple millennia later. And right now, that area is modern-day Iraq. Persia was further east in modern-day Iran. So modern-day Iraq, all this is happening. What's the significance of moving east? When Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, do you remember? A guard was set to the east of Eden. They were pushed out east. When Cain was cast from God's presence, he went to the east, further and further away. And now, after the flood, men move even further east. I think the idea is mankind is being further and further distanced from God and his holy place, which was the promised land, and their connection with him and his presence. I think that's the idea. Mankind, though, is gathering in one space out to the east. They're setting up a city, which shows probably that they're setting up another place of worship. It's not the one place where God should be worshiped, right? The place in the promised land. But they're setting up another city, another tower. Verse 3, it says, each man said, come, let us make bricks and bake them, use brick for stone and tar for mortar. That actually helps us, that verse. Helps us to know when this happened. You know how people divide up ages between the Stone Age and the Iron Age and all those things. Well, we know that this kiln-fired brick technology developed in the 4th millennium BC. So we can date the Tower of Babel way, way back, all the way to that. These people, though, they were advancing in technology. And that's increasing their ability to do evil. Verse 4, they say, let us build ourselves a city. Do you know why cities were built back in the 4th millennium BC? It wasn't for people to live in. People didn't live in cities. Cities were places for public buildings, right? And especially, they were related to temples. So most of the things in the city had to do with, it was connected somehow to the temple complex. This means that they were probably, in my mind, constructing an idol temple and the things that go along with it. And this tower that they built is not just any old tower. What they were constructing was called a ziggurat. I have a picture of one that has been reconstructed in modern day. This is kind of what a ziggurat looked like. It was a big, tall building, had a huge set of stairs that went up to the heavens. They kind of looked like a pyramid, but they functioned differently. Okay, I think a pyramid is a tomb. Am I right about that? But there's no inside to a ziggurat. You don't go inside a ziggurat. It's basically a big stairway up to the sky, a ladder to heaven, so to speak, right? This might be what Jacob sees in his ladder, right? He sees it going up to heaven. Archaeologists have found as many as 30 of these ziggurats in this same area. They've dug them up and they've found these things. Now, why in the land of Sumer, in Iraq, would you have ziggurats, but not in other places like Israel and Palestine and those places? It's because there are no mountains in Iraq. It's a plain. Remember the plain of Shinar. In ancient times, people believed, and just because they believe this and the Bible doesn't dispel, doesn't mean that the Bible is saying that this is scientifically true, but people believed that mountains held up the sky and that the sky was solid, right? People believed the sky was solid until the Renaissance. I mean, but the sky was heaven's floor. And so since there were no mountains in the area that I know of, they built a tower with its head into the heavens, right, to make their way up. What was the purpose of a ziggurat like this? They were usually dedicated to a deity. So right underneath, at the base of it, was the temple, right? And so at the top of the ziggurat, there was a gate. And through this gate, it was thought the gods could get into their home in heaven, right? At the bottom was the temple, where hopefully the gods would come down and enter the temple and receive sacrifices and gifts of the people. They could relate to the people, that sort of thing. And at some point on the stairway, there was a place where the gods could rest and be refreshed on their long journey from heaven to earth and the stairway, right? I know it's a weird way of thinking, but this is how people thought in the ancient world. And common people did not use ziggurats. They didn't walk up the steps. They didn't use them for any reason, actually. Ziggurats were not built for people. They were built for gods, for gods to travel from one realm to another. And so the idea was, let's make a tower where probably an idol, a false deity, a false god can come down into this city, this temple complex that we've built him, right? That seems to be the offense to me. They say, let us make a name for ourselves. Do you think that was a prideful thing? Were they trying to be famous? It's possible, but if everybody had gathered there, like if that's where all the people of the world were gathering, then I don't know that you would need to make a tower to make yourself famous. It's possible. Do you know, being forgotten was the greatest fear in the ancient world. For people not to remember you was to go into non-existence, right? And so that's part of the reason why people worshiped their ancestors and things like that. And what people would often do is they would build a building or a monument to themselves or do some sort of historically significant act or deed so that they wouldn't be forgotten. And so I do think they were being prideful, right? I'm not saying that they weren't, but it seems like they're doing this out of fear. They're worried that if they don't make a name for themselves, they'll be scattered and forgotten. Jim?
I think it was to bring